Okay, so when I say the word Viking, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Probably some huge, wild-eyed guy with a giant axe, right? Well, today we're going to peel back the layers of that whole legend and ask a simple question. Who were these people really? And yeah, chances are the image you just cooked up is something like this, the Berserker. I mean, the Old Norse stories paint this picture of them as these warrior shamans who would just flip a switch and go into this crazy, uncontrollable battle fury. Think of them as the special forces of the Viking Age, the absolute elite shock troops. The stories, the sagas, say they would channel animal spirits, bears, wolves, right in the middle of a fight. You can imagine how that would look to their enemies. Pretty much superhuman. So that's the Viking we all know from movies and TV, right? The terrifying raider. But here's the thing. Was that the whole story? Spoiler alert, it's not even close. To really get who the Vikings were, we've got to look way beyond the battlefield. See, the Viking Age, it wasn't just powered by brute force. It was actually driven by this incredibly sophisticated engine of commerce and technology. So what was the fuel for this engine? What let this, let's face it, relatively small group of people from Scandinavia just explode across the map? The answer comes down to one word: silver. And look, this silver wasn't just from raiding, though, yeah, that was definitely part of it. They were building this complex global economy. They were getting these massive tribute payments, like the famous Danegeld. That was basically a huge tax the English paid them just to be left alone. They were trading like crazy with the Islamic world for these silver coins called dirhams. They were even cashing in on the silver mining boom down in Germany. You have to picture it like a literal river of silver flowing right into Scandinavia. And that wealth, maybe even more than their axes, was the real source of their power. Okay, but what's really cool is how they use all this silver. They came up with this super smart weight-based system. You had hack silver, which is exactly what it sounds like, chopped up jewelry, bits of coins, and they'd weigh it out for these incredibly precise payments. Then you had a whole objects, big arm rings, necklaces. They were also valued by weight, but they were also these walking wearable symbols of status. This wasn't some primitive barter system. This was a super flexible, super practical way to handle money for people who were always on the move. So this mountain of silver, it wasn't just for showing off. It paid for the single most important piece of tech that basically defined the whole Viking Age. I'm talking, of course, about the longship, and it was an absolute masterpiece of engineering. The way the oak planks overlapped made it strong, but also flexible enough for rough seas. But the real game changer? It had a super shallow draft. That meant it could cross the brutal North Sea and then just keep going, right up a shallow river to hit a town deep inland where nobody, and I mean nobody, was expecting a sea attack. With both a sail and oars for power, it was the perfect machine for raiding, for trading, and for exploring. Okay, so you've got this combination of serious cash and superior technology. What happens next? Well, the Vikings didn't just stay raiders. They started to evolve. They went from being chieftains of little warbands to full-on ambitious kingdom builders. And this change happened fast. I mean, breathtakingly fast. You've got guys like Harald Fairhair starting to pull Norway together. Then, just a century or so later, Harald Bluetooth unites Denmark and brings in Christianity, plugging his kingdom right into the European grid. And it all leads up to rulers like Canute the Great. By 1016, this guy wasn't just some chieftain. He was the king of a massive North Sea empire that included England. The whole era kind of symbolically wraps up in 1066, when Harald Hardrada dies while fighting for the throne of England. Think about that. They went from being outsiders to being players for the biggest crowns in Europe. And their reach was just incredible. I mean, they made it all the way to North America, to Vinland. But here's what's also really telling about them. As the historian Birgitta Linderoth Wallace points out, it was this bold experiment that they dropped pretty quickly when it wasn't paying off. That shows you they weren't just about the glory of conquest. They were driven by results. All right, so we've got savvy traders and powerful kings, but that still isn't the whole picture. Now we're going to dig into the legal and social side of things. And honestly, this might be the most surprising part of their entire story. So, beyond the big-name kings and famous warriors, how did their society actually run? How did they settle arguments or make laws? The answer is this really cool institution called the Thing. Just look at this painting. It shows the Althing, the big assembly they had in Iceland. And notice where it is. It's not in some stuffy, closed-off building. It's out in the open. This was literally the political and legal heart of their world. So the thing, or thing as they would have said it in Old Norse, was basically a governing assembly of free people. It's where they upheld laws, debated the big decisions, and made sure justice was served. It was a cornerstone of their society, a way to create order in what we often think of as a really chaotic time. But that brings up a pretty big question, right? When we hear assembly of free people from that long ago, we kind of automatically think, well, it was just for the men, wasn't it? A total old boys club? Well, hold on, because the reality was way more complex. If you look at this diagram, yeah, the core guys, the ones with the votes, those were powerful men. But see that circle around them? That's a whole other group of active participants, people who could be witnesses, people who could bring their own legal cases to the assembly. And this is where the story gets super interesting, because that group was a lot more diverse than you might think.
Okay, get this. The earliest Norwegian laws are super clear that some women had a real, legal voice at the thing. Widows, for example, could call the assembly themselves to go after their husband's killer. There were these so-called ring women, unmarried women with no close male relatives who could inherit property and actually represent themselves in court. Women who were running the household while their husband was off trading or raiding, they had legal standing too. And they could all be witnesses or make their own claims for compensation. I mean, come on, that is a million miles away from the simple stereotype we usually get.
Now, let's be real. Viking society was not some modern, equal paradise. Not at all. But it was so much more complex, more nuanced, and yeah, in some really important ways, more inclusive than the simple legend of a bunch of bearded guys with axes would have you believe. Okay, so let's pull all these threads together. When you look at all the evidence, the silver, the incredible ships, the kings, the laws, a totally new and much more complete picture of the Vikings starts to emerge. So you've got the myth over here, this one-dimensional, horned, helmet-wearing barbarian who just lives to plunder. And then you've got the reality over here, a sophisticated trader connected to a global network, a pioneering explorer who reached a new continent, a smart lawmaker who built complex legal systems, and a strategic kingdom builder who forged empires. So you see, their story isn't just about conquest and violence. It's a story of culture, of economics, of some surprisingly advanced laws, and of a connectedness that completely changed the course of European history. They went from being raiders to being lawmakers. Their entire world was built on so much more than just an axe. It was built on silver, on incredible ingenuity, and on a surprisingly strong foundation of community and law. So I'll leave you with this question. What does the word Viking mean to you now?